Chapter 10, Muscular Tissue. How skeletal muscles produce movement. So let's start by defining what movement is and how skeletal muscle accomplishes this. So skeletal muscles produce movement by exerting forces on tendons. Tendons attach to the bones and pull. So this is a big part. When we talk about muscle contraction, we talk about how muscles pull bones to the origin. So the point of insertion is moving to the origin. So we always see muscles pulling, never pushing. And then, of course, since we get this movement, the movement occurs. So we introduced the two words on the last slide, origin and insertion. So now let's define these. So most muscles cross at least one joint and are attached to the articulating bone. When a muscle contracts, it draws one bone towards the other. We can break these up into 2 points of attachment. Number one, the origin. This is the attachment to the stationary bone, so the part that is not moving. And then the insertion. This is the attachment to the movable bone. So again, when the muscle contracts, we're moving the insertion to pulling it to the origin. So we could compare our joints to a lever system and how it leverages the weight to get our movement. So typically we think of this like a seesaw where we have a fulcrum, right? So a pivot point. We have a load that we have to overcome with an effort. Okay, so in my drawing, my seesaw is perfectly even where the effort equals the load. Now, the lever is acted on by these few concepts, resistance and that effort. So again, resistance would be the load, so the weight that we have to overcome in order to move that joint. Now we have different types of lever systems, okay? So the first is called a seesaw lever, where the fulcrum is located between the resistance and the applied force. So this is what I drew before, a perfect seesaw. So if we look at our example where our skull meets our first vertebra or atlas, we know those occipital condyles rest in the facets of the atlas, and if you rock your head up and down in that yes fashion, this is the movement. But what's happening? We have all these muscles in the back of our head, in our neck, that are contracting to overcome the load, which is your cranial and facial bone. So the reason why your chin doesn't stay fixed to your chest all day long is because of these muscles. The next lever is a second-class lever. This is known as a power lever. This is also known as a wheelbarrow lever. Here we see that it moves a large resistance or a large weight over a short distance. So the fulcrum is really close to the resistance. So look at our example. Here's our fulcrum. Here's our load or resistance. And the effort is way behind, just like a wheelbarrow. If we think about if you were to do calf raises when you go to the gym, your gastrocnemius and your soleus are contracting upwards to pull on your heel, which is going to lift your entire body weight onto the balls of your feet, which are that fulcrum. The next and most common lever in the body are third-class levers. These are called speed levers. Here the speed is directly related to the resistance. If the resistance is high, then the speed is slow. So you think of it like a pen versus a textbook, right? So with the textbook, the resistance is high, so the speed is slow, whereas with the pen, it can be faster because the resistance is low. And look where our fulcrum is. It's way in back. The effort is in the middle of the fulcrum and the load or the resistance. So what we said before on the last slide, just written out for you, first class lever are seesaw levers. The fulcrum is located between the resistance and the applied force. With a second class lever or power lever, it moves a large resistance over a short distance. Here the fulcrum is close to the resistance. With a speed lever or third class lever, here the speed is directly related to the resistance. If resistance is high, speed is slow. And again, just to reiterate, the most common system in the body is a third-class lever, the speed levers. So to put it a little more specifics into separate pictures, we see our seesaw here. where the resistance are those facial bones, and the contraction of the spinalis capitis, which is going to help keep that head upright instead of crashing down to your chest. Again, our second class lever, our wheelbarrow lever, look at the contraction of the soleus and the gastrocnemius, lifting us onto our balls of our feet. Again, these are calf raises when you go to the gym and work those lower leg muscles. Lastly, we have our third class lever. This is contraction of our bicep, was our example. This was our speed lever, where the fulcrum is way in back, the applied force is in the middle, and the resistance is in front. The next thing we're going to talk about is the effects of fascicle arrangement. So muscle fibers are arranged in parallel bundles with fascicles, but the arrangement of fasciculi in relation to the tendon can vary. So go back to our muscle physiology lecture where we talked about how we build the muscle with the bundles within bundles within bundles. Now these bundles can arrange in various locations with regard to this tendon. Now fascicular arrangement is correlated with a couple things, meaning number one, the amount of power that muscle can produce, as well as the range of motion that muscle can produce. So let's take a look at a couple examples. So table 11.1 gives us some examples and name of muscles for arrangement of fascicles. So for our parallel fashion, fascicles parallel to the longitudinal axis of the muscle terminate at either end into a flat tendon. An example would be the sternohyoid muscle. So again, as we name these muscles, we are going to get to these in our muscle list in lab, but again, the name tells us, muscles are key with names, so the names tell us where it is or what it does. For example, sternohyoid, so we're connecting the sternum to the hyoid bone. Next is a fusiform muscle where the fascicles are nearly parallel to the longitudinal axis of the muscle. They terminate in a flat tendon, but the muscle tapers toward the tendon where the diameter is less than at its belly. An example is the digastric muscle. So if you feel underneath your chin, right where your mandible is, you'll feel those two muscles right there are your digastric. Next, we can arrange them into a circular fashion. Fascicles in concentric circular arrangements form sphincter muscles that enclose an orifice or an opening. We go to the outside of our body like facial muscles around the mouth, around the eye. Look at our word orbicularis, so circling the oculi, eye muscles. Next is triangular. These are fascicles that spread over broad areas covering at a thick central tendon. This gives muscles a triangular appearance. So the example would be that large chest muscle, the pectoralis major. Next are a class of muscles called pennant muscles. Now, if you think about what pennant means, this is flag-like. So think about a flag where it connects to a mast. So a unipennant muscle where fascicles are arranged on only one side of the tendon. So again, the tendon would be like our mast, and then here's our flag. So if you've ever seen at a store a flag shooting straight up in the air, one flag on one post, this would be similar to a unipennant muscle. An example would be the extensor digitorum longus. So again, naming muscles are important. Extensor gives us an action. It extends. What does it extend? Look at the next word, digitorum. So the digits. And with balance, with biology, there's always balance. There is a longus. If there's a longus, there's probably going to be a brevis for small. Next is a bipennant muscle. So again, bipennant, by two flags aside the mast. So here's our mast, flag 1, flag 2. Fascicles arranged on both sides of a centrally positioned tendon. An example would be the muscle of our leg, the rectus femoris muscle. Next is a multipennant muscle. So this is the fascicles attached obliquely from many directions to several tendons. So again, we have our mast, 1, 2, 3 flags. An example is that big triangular shaped muscles in your shoulder, the deltoid muscle. Now, when we put it all together, we have to understand how muscles work together. Now, we hinted to this in our previous lectures, and we're going to elaborate now. Now, most muscle movements are coordinated by several skeletal muscles acting in groups rather than individually. And most skeletal muscles are arranged in opposing pairs at joints. So, we see words like prime mover or agonist. This is the muscle or muscles who are primarily responsible for an action. For example, if you flex your arm, right, flex your lower arm in the joint at the elbow, the biceps brachii and the brachialis are the prime movers, or those two muscles responsible for that action. Then we have our antagonists. So this is the muscle that is eccentrically contracting. So again, the prime mover is a concentric contraction, whereas the antagonist is the eccentric contractor. So with our example of flexion of the forearm at the elbow, remember we said that the tricep is opposing that bicep, so that is the antagonist. The next word we look at is synergists. So what synergists do is synergistic muscles work together to get a specific action. So for example, for flexion of the forearm, the biceps brachii and the brachialis are synergists. They are working together, so more than one muscle, to give you one common action. So our next topic is going to be how skeletal muscles are named. So when we're naming muscles, we can name them based on a couple variables. One can be location, 2, size, 3, number of origins, like the bicep, right? Bi means 2, tricep means 3. Appearance, direction of the fibers, origin and insertion, recall that sternohyoid, and of course, muscle action. So table 11.2 gives us characteristics used to name muscle. So let's look at direction first. So the orientation of the muscle fascicles relative to the body's midline. So we look at rectus. Rectus means straight, right? So we're parallel to the midline, like the rectus abdominis. Transverse, so perpendicular. So this is where all those words that we dealt with, surface terms, those foundational terms that we dealt with week 1 or that first lecture, are going to come back right here and help us out. Our transverse, perpendicular to the midline. Remember our transverse cut. So the example of a muscle would be the transverse abdominis. Oblique, diagonal to the midline, like the external oblique, those muscles on the sides of your abdomens. Next, we could look at size. So size of the muscle. Remember with biology, everything's balanced. Maximus means largest, like the gluteus maximus. And if there's a maximus, there's going to be a minimus, so smallest, like gluteus minimus. We have a longus for long and a brevis for short. Again, balance. Abductor or adductor longus and adductor brevis. Now look at the action. So we can say action too. So this is the long muscle and the short one, but what does it do? It adducts, right? So if you take your hand, open your fingers, and now close your fingers to bring them back together, that is adduction. So we'll look at the muscles in the leg that are going to allow us to adduct the legs, bring it closer to the midline of our body. Next, latissimus, meaning widest, so the widest muscle on our back is the latissimus dorsi. Look at the word back, dorsi. The latissimus dorsi, so again, if we have a widest, we have a longest, longissimus, like longissimus capitis. It tells us size as well as where it is, capitis head. Magnus for large, and the adductor magnus. We look at major, minor, so large and small. Pectoralis major, that big chest muscle. If you go back to the John Cena commercials where he does hefty, 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 that is the pectoralis major. And then underneath it, we have the pectoralis minor, so smaller. And then we get huge muscles like the vastus, vastus lateralis. Next, we could characterize muscles based on shape. So triangular, deltoid, right? The example would be the deltoid muscle. Trapezoid will be trapezius, and again in our back, the trapezius muscle. Now this is a cool one. The sawtooth muscle is called serratus. So serratus anterior, where it connects by our ribs. If you think of a serrated knife, that sawtooth jagged edge, this is what the muscle looks like. Diamond shape, rhomboid, rhomboid major. Circular, orbicularis. We have orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris for around the mouth. Comb-like, pectinate, like the pectineus. Pear-shaped, piriformis. Flat, platus, so in our neck, the shaving muscle is platysma. Square or four-sided, quadratus, like the quadratus femoris. And slender, gracilis, and the muscle is the gracilis. As we continue with our table, let's look at the characteristics of action. So here's our actions again. Flexors decrease the joint angle. Extensors increase the joint angle. They flex and extend. Abductors, adductors, levators, they raise or elevate. Depressors, lower or depress. Supinators, there's our correct anatomical position. Turn your palms upwards or anterior. Pronators, turn your palms posterior. Sphincters, which we covered, decreasing size of openings. Tensor, makes body rigid. Rotators, like the rotatores, rotates bones around a longitudinal axis in your vertebra. So let's look at some examples. Flexor, carpi radialis, so it tells us a lot here. It flexes the wrist bones, carpi, along the radius. So the terminology is going to help us get a location or an idea of where to look for these muscles. Next are extensor, carpi ulnar, same route. They extend, carpi, the wrist, and the muscle rungs along the ulna. Now for abductor, abductor pollicis longus, and more adductor, so abductor versus adductor, so abduct versus adduct, the adductor longus. And then an elevator, right? So we're elevating parts. Levator scapulae, so raise your shoulders. So the levator scapulae helps to do that. Depressor labii inferioris. So here we go again. Look at our terminology. 1, depresses, labii, lips. Inferior, the inferior portion of our lips. Supinator for supinates. Pronator teres for pronator. External anal sphincter for sphincter. The TFL, tensor fascia latae, for the part that makes our body rigid. And the rotadores. Next, we look at number of origins. So 2 origins would be biceps, 3 origins, triceps, 4 origins, quadriceps. And you probably already guessed the muscles. Biceps brachii, triceps brachii, and quadriceps femoris, which makes up, if you guessed the 4 different muscles. Next, we can name muscles based on location. So what bone is it found from? Or surface term, like temporalis, so it's muscle near the temporal bone, or occipitalis, or frontalis, by those associated bones. Next, let's name by origin and insertion. We already said the sternohyoid. We can look at sternocleidomastoid. So here's our bone terms again. Sternum, cleido means bridges, so it bridges the mastoid process to the sternum. So again, origin and insertion. So originating on the sternum and clavicle and inserting on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Now we're going to end this lecture with an overview of the principal skeletal muscles. So what you're going to have to learn in lab. Now you'll see that there's a ton of slides in your lecture PowerPoint that are not covered in this tutorial. And the reason being is they are going to be solely to help you for lab. Now you can see that this view has all the muscles. We're going to be focusing in lab on the head, the neck, the shoulders, the arms, the chest, the abdomen, the forearm, the hands, the legs, the lower legs, the buttocks, etc. So this is a good broad stroke view of most of the muscles, all the muscles that you're going to be required to know. And again, look at your muscle list to know which muscles and their associated actions. Our last slide is the posterior superficial view of those skeletal muscles that you will be identifying in lab. Again, as a review, look at your lab documents to identify the specific muscles and actions you are required to know.